It's great love that came out to meet you. Of his great love that's been coming through. Of his great love that's been coming out to entreat you. Of his love that's been coming through. Can be your love or my love. Can be his love or her love. Love is a light that casts away darkness. It finds its way into every heart. Pour forth your soul like water flows to sea. Then we will be all we're meant to be.
Shalom, I am Rabbi Shaul Praver. You're watching Rabbi Rock. We have the distinguished pleasure of being here once again with Dr. Herbert Ausubel, who enjoyed a distinguished career as a practicing physician, educator, and researcher. The man is a genius and has a very interesting way of presenting history. He will assume the characters of his family in the first person as if he was there right now. Sit back, fasten your seatbelts, enjoy the ride. We are speaking with Eugene de Pilon. The year is 1780. He's a French nobleman. That's the year he was born. How are you, sir?
Fine, thank you. As Eugene de Pilon, I will tell you my story. At the time I was born, the bulk of world Jewry lived in Europe. But the Jews were not a group of Eskimos living in some isolated area at great distance from the rest of the European population. Instead, they were a minority in many countries, sometimes tolerated, on other occasions persecuted. And in the year of my birth, you could still be burnt at the stake for being a Jew in Spain. All too often, the Jewish people were made scapegoats for anything that took place of an adverse nature in the land in which they resided. And so I will tell you my story in the context of world events taking place around the Jewish community, which had such a dramatic impact on their lives. In the spring, the dark earth is recalled to life by the sound of raindrops. Nature blossoms forth in an orchestra of color, green and gold, red and violet. Summer's warmth, like the mellow trumpet, brings spirit and vibrancy to the budding world. In the security of a warm nest, baby sparrows listen to the chirping of their elders, preparing for the day when they too will soar into the blue and seek mates to share a home of their own. A chilling autumn wind plays deep notes on the eternal cello, heralding the retreat of youth to age. One burst of color remains, the final glow of the flame before the fire of life goes out, and then the long winter's darkness. We are born, we live and share this earth. We die, but we leave something behind, some word, some mark, some little change from what had been before. And the history of the world is the sum of those tiny transformations. I'm going to tell you a different type of story, a love story, because love can have such a dramatic impact on our lives. As the rabbi mentioned, my name is Eugene de Palan. I was born in 1780 in France. As the eldest son of the Count de Palan, I stood as heir to his title, to his grand chateau, and to his vast estates. Like most Frenchmen, and certainly most members of the aristocracy, we were Catholic. The France into which I was born was a classed society. At the top was the king and the royal family. Then there were the nobles and their families that controlled much of the landscape. There was the clergy. I speak of the Catholic clergy because, as I mentioned, most Frenchmen were Catholic. They were not expected to be replaced by children, but rather by novice priests coming from the other classes. And finally, there were the commoners, divided into two groups: the serfs, who tended the land owned by the nobility, and the city dwellers, merchants and artisans. There were few working in industrial enterprises because we're now just at the beginning of the industrial era. All this came to an end, so to speak, in 1789 with the French Revolution. The lower classes had revolted, and now the heads of the aristocracy, including those of the king and queen, were severed by a guillotine. Old scores were settled, and many who were not of the nobility lost their heads. My family, the de Palans, well, fortunately we lived at significant distance from Paris, the center of the turmoil, and we changed from our silk breeches into long woolen trousers and remained as unobtrusive as possible to keep our heads on our shoulders. Incidentally, I should mention that in France there were peoples who weren't Catholic. They were the Protestant Huguenots, who a few generations before had been crushed. Many of them had fled France. Some had remained, mostly in towns quietly of their own. And finally there were the Jews. Well, they came and went, depending upon whether the king allowed them to stay there or drove them out, but always under religious restrictions. They were, of course, commoners, but they were involved not in serfdom. They were in the cities and towns working as merchants and artisans, and hopeful that they would be allowed to stay another few years before some other king throw them out. In any case, all of this came to an end with the French Revolution. All of Europe acted angrily to this overturn of the old order. And the armies of several nations invaded France. The country itself was in danger. And so thousands rallied to the flag. And one general in particular, Napoleon Bonaparte was his name, managed to drive out the invading armies, after which he crowned himself Emperor of France. Well, he spread his power all over the continent, employing first the retention of the nobility and the class system, while at the same time espousing the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. Now, many welcomed him. For example, Poland had been at once a gigantic nation, had been gobbled up by its three neighbors. Well, Napoleon resurrected it as a Duchy of Warsaw, gaining for him the gratitude of the Polish people. The Jews all over Europe, interestingly enough, were grateful to Napoleon. In France, they were grateful because he ended religious restrictions. And they were particularly grateful because he ended the heinous Spanish Inquisition. I should mention that after his death and defeat, the Inquisition returned. But in any case, while Napoleon was there was no Inquisition. By 1812, all of Europe was under his sway, except for England, which was after all separated by water, and Russia. a gigantic medieval kingdom headed by a Tsar.